Maddie.
I'm Coltra.
And I'm Aaron, and welcome to this podcast. Today we're going to be tackling this question. In what ways and to what extent did absolutism affect the power and the status of the European nobility from 1650 to 1750? And our main argument for this is going to be that actions taken by kings throughout absolutist nations in Europe allowed themselves to gain greater amounts of power. This was done at the expense of nobles who suffered drops in both power and status. And for our examples, we are going to use France under Louis XIV and Russia under Peter the Great. So Maddie, why don't you tell us about France?
France had civil servants that Louis had called intendants, and they established royal authority in the provinces and helped control the provinces around France, who had a history and culture of governing themselves. And these intendants were not nobles, so the nobles kind of lost power and authority in those ranks, but Louis still kept them entertained and organized and kept a close eye on them in his building of Versailles.
So basically, intendants were Louis's royal civil servants, and they went to areas in France that had, like Maddie said, a history of governing themselves and sort of letting royal rule take a backseat to local authority. And the intendants went to these areas and they forced royal authority upon these areas.
And so, going back to our original thesis that we had said at the beginning, the intendants are taking the power of the nobles in the way that the peasants are the ones enforcing power into local areas of France. Whereas the nobles used to do that, now it's in the hands of the intendants. And because the intendants have the power, they're also somewhat rising in social class. So if you're a noble, now, for one thing, you don't have any power because the intendants are taking that away from you. And there's not as much status to your name because you're not really doing anything for the people. It's all being done by the intendants. The role of the intendant became more and more important with the centralization of the power. Louis was gathering power for himself, and to do that he used the intendants to impose his authority. The nobles weren't in the picture at all. So, as Louis gains more and more power, he relies on the intendants more and more, and then the nobles just start to lose more and more power because Louis doesn't need them, the intendants certainly don't need them, so their power diminishes.
Right, and as the post of intendant grew more and more important, it was also accompanied by a gradual extinction of local self-government.
So what kept the nobles from plotting against the king?
So, in addition to the intendants, Louis was also distracting the nobles by through his palace of Versailles. So you know what Versailles is, right, Maddie?
Yeah, it was a building right outside of France where Louis lived, and within those confines the noble lives too. So basically they would dine and dance to win and please Louis.
Right, so the nobles were distracting this golden palace of sorts, and the intendants were busy enforcing the king's power. So the nobles wouldn't want to turn against the king because the nobles are having a great time, right?
Yeah, Versailles was basically just like a golden cage in which Louis kept the nobles locked and away from scheming and plotting against him. And this worked great because the nobles were unaware of this fact because Versailles provided them with constant entertainment.
Exactly. So the nobles had no reason to turn against the king because the nobles were very satisfied.
So in conclusion, the nobles' powers were diminished thanks to the intendants, but Versailles distracted many from taking influential power from the king. However, a noble could become an intendant and take part in local enforcement of the king's laws. So noble status was slowly being challenged by intendants in terms of social status. Nobles never tried to get back their power or status because they were distracted by the wonders in Versailles.
Another country that had a powerful absolute monarch was Russia under Peter the Great, and he also limited nobles' power and status, and the main tool that he used to do this was the table of ranks. In his efforts to westernize Russia, Peter introduced the table of ranks in 1722, and the table of ranks was a ranking system, and it was based on government service, as opposed to family history, which was the way that nobles used to obtain their power and their status. The table of ranks established 14 ranks, and it provided for orderly advancement from the lowest to the highest tier, even to those who were born of lowly birth.
So the table of ranks allowed for non-nobles to raise their social status to be almost equal, even better than nobles. So the way the table of ranks worked was that everyone had to start to work harder to increase their rank. You weren't just born a noble of higher status or born a peasant of lower status. You were born somewhere, but you had to work in order to increase your rank slowly throughout your lifetime, and eventually your kids would hopefully be born with higher ranks, and then it would go on, and the farther you got, the higher you would get in the table.
And an incentive to work your way up the table of ranks was that you received different privileges based on your rank within this table.
Did people accept this system?
The table of ranks was essentially, I guess nobles kind of did have to accept the system, the boyars in Russia. When Peter created the table, anyone who was a peasant was definitely willing to go along. If you're any peasant or serf in Russia, life was pretty rough for you. You didn't have much food, you were kind of living out in the cold, and then this table comes along, and you're definitely going to jump on board because you want to be able to increase your status. That way you can get a better job, get more money, get more power, get a better house, get a better quality of life. If you're a noble, on the other hand, if you're a Russian boyar, you're going to be a little more reluctant. But the way the ranking system worked was that everyone could still go up. So even if you were already a boyar, the boyars also had something to gain because there were higher and lower levels of nobility, and you could reach ranks above what was known as boyar nobility. So the peasants would definitely jump on board because they could only go up. And the boyars would also jump on board because they could go up, so everyone could better their lives in some way. Does that answer your question, Maddie?
Yes, it does.
Awesome.
So whereas in the old Russian system, you were born with the title of noble and people inherited the status of noble, now people had to work to achieve this status.
Exactly.
So to sum things up, noble power in Russia was diminished by the table of ranks because nobles and people had to work in order to advance in the ranking system if they hoped to retain any power. And social ranking was also reordered because, like I said, people had to work hard to maintain their rank or else they would risk losing status and influence.
So this brings us back to our original argument that actions taken by the king throughout absolutist nations in Europe allow themselves to gain greater amounts of power. This was done at the expense of the nobles, who suffered drops in both power and in status.
So you saw this in France through Louis XIV's use of intendants and the Palace of Versailles, and also in Peter the Great's Russia with his use of the table of ranks.
And I guess that's about it for our podcast. Thanks for listening.